Inside the walls of Kensington Palace, heartbreak struck without warning. A royal nanny's trembling voice delivered devastating news. Prince Louis had fallen critically ill. Standing nearby, Princess Charlotte broke into uncontrollable tears, overwhelmed by fear for her little brother. The moment shattered the royal calm and exposed a family's raw, emotional truth. What began as an ordinary morning turned into a nightmare no crown could prevent. What happened to Louis? And how did it nearly break the royal family? Nanny's cry, the moment everything changed. It was a quiet early morning at Adelaide Cottage, the private royal residence where Prince William and Princess Catherine raised their children in as normal a life as possible. The day began like any other. Breakfast trays were being arranged, uniforms laid out, and the familiar laughter of Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte echoed from the playroom. But all of that stopped the moment the nanny answered a private call from the palace's medical team. She had cared for the Wales children for years, trusted, discreet, loving, but in that moment, her hands trembled. Her expression changed instantly, and her voice dropped to a whisper. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Down the hall, Charlotte, George, and Louis were playing with puzzles on the nursery floor. The nanny entered, her usually calm demeanor visibly shaken. She knelt beside Charlotte and gently reached for her hand. "Charlotte, sweetheart, I need you to listen carefully." Her voice cracked. Charlotte's eyes widened, sensing the weight in her tone. The nanny continued, barely managing to speak. "It's Louis. He's very sick. The doctors are on their way." The words hung in the air, impossibly heavy. At first, there was silence. Charlotte blinked, then her eyes filled. Her face crumpled, and in the next breath, she broke into tears. "No, not Louis," she whispered, clutching the nanny's sleeve. George remained frozen, standing awkwardly by the window, too old not to understand, too young to know what to do. Louis, the subject of the unfolding fear, simply looked between them all, confused, unaware of the storm gathering around him. The nanny held Charlotte tightly, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. The moment was quiet, raw, and real. The kind of grief that only exists before the headlines, before public statements. This was not a royal crisis. This was a sister's panic for her baby brother. Downstairs, staff scrambled. A private medical team was already en route. Palace security tightened. William and Catherine were contacted immediately. But upstairs, in the nursery, it was Charlotte's tears that told the real story. The innocence of childhood suddenly pierced by a fear too large for her age. The nanny, a figure of love and loyalty, tried to remain composed, but the guilt was already setting in. Had she missed something? Was there a warning she failed to see? She would replay that morning 1,000 times in her mind. But in that moment, all she could do was hold Charlotte and whisper again, "We're going to help him. He's not alone." Charlotte didn't respond. She only cried harder, because deep down, in the purest part of her heart, she already knew something was seriously wrong. This moment became the emotional heartbeat of the entire ordeal. Before doctors arrived, before headlines erupted, before the royal family issued any statements, a young girl broke into tears, mourning not a tragedy that had happened, but one she feared was coming. That was the beginning, and nothing after would ever feel quite the same. What happened to Prince Louis? Timeline of the tragedy. In the days leading up to the crisis, Prince Louis had been quieter than usual. The playful, energetic youngest child of William and Catherine had become unusually tired, often curling up on the couch instead of bouncing through the halls. At first, no one thought much of it. Children get tired. They have off days. But the nanny, who had known Louis since infancy, noticed more. He skipped meals. His usual laughter disappeared. One evening, he refused to eat at all and fell asleep on the floor beside his toys. Something wasn't right. She alerted the palace's pediatric team. Out of precaution, a royal physician was scheduled to visit. But by the time morning arrived, the situation had worsened. Louis had a high fever and was barely responsive. That was when the call came. Early that morning, just as the family began their routine, the nanny, already on edge, received confirmation. Prince Louis was showing signs of a serious systemic infection, possibly viral in origin, but complicated by underlying inflammation. Catherine and William were immediately summoned back to Adelaide Cottage from separate engagements. The family crisis was unfolding quickly, and there was no protocol for this. Not when it was your child. Charlotte was in the room when the medical staff first arrived. She watched as her brother was gently lifted onto a gurney, his skin pale and warm. His eyes fluttered open for just a second, and then closed again. The image broke her. She stood in the corner, hands over her mouth, tears running freely. That was the moment it became real for everyone. The palace shifted into emergency mode. Louis was transferred under full medical escort to a private treatment wing inside London's Royal Brompton Hospital. The Wales family followed behind, protected by a wall of security and silence. As the convoy moved, Britain remained unaware. The public still believed everything was fine. But behind closed doors, a family was crumbling under the weight of fear. The nurse's confession. What really went wrong? As Prince Louis lay surrounded by machines, monitors, and hushed voices, the royal nanny sat down with doctors, shaken, sleepless, and overcome with guilt. She had been the first to see the signs, and now she blamed herself for not reacting faster. In a quiet conference room away from the children, she gave her full account to the royal medical staff. He was just quiet, not himself. I thought it was just a cold, but then he started to wince when standing. I should have acted sooner. The doctors reassured her. The symptoms were subtle, the progression swift. No one could have predicted how quickly his condition would escalate. Still, she couldn't forgive herself. Catherine joined halfway through the briefing. Her eyes were red. The moment the nanny described Louis moaning in pain during sleep, Catherine broke down. She clutched her hand over her mouth, trying to keep it together. But the emotional weight of hearing how her son had suffered, quietly, unknowingly, shattered her. The nanny cried too. I failed him, she whispered. Catherine reached for her. You didn't. You loved him. You still do. It was one of those rare moments where royal roles disappeared, and what remained were just two women, bonded by love and fear for the same little boy. Meanwhile, the medical team had launched full diagnostic scans. Louis's condition was identified as an acute inflammatory response, possibly linked to a rare autoimmune trigger. His organs were under stress. His vitals were unstable. He would remain under 24-hour watch in the ICU. Charlotte, back at the palace, had begun refusing food. She didn't want to see friends. She simply sat on her bed, staring at her brother's empty pillow. Her world had gone quiet, and she was only 8 years old. Prince William's shock, a father's angry despair. The call reached Prince William while he was attending a security briefing related to upcoming Commonwealth events. The words came quickly. Lewis, hospital, ICU. He didn't say a word, just stood, pale-faced, and left the room. Inside the car, William's hands shook. He kept replaying the last few moments he'd had with Lewis, his son's laughter during breakfast 2 days ago, the hug he gave before bed. Had he missed something? When he entered the hospital, his composure cracked. Nurses reported that he moved quickly through the corridor. No greetings, no eye contact, just a father desperate to see his son. He entered the ICU and stood at the foot of the bed. Lewis looked so small. Machines beeped. Tubes and wires covered more of him than William could process. He leaned in and whispered, "It's Papa. I'm here." But Lewis didn't stir. William turned to the lead physician. "Tell me everything," he demanded, voice low and sharp. As he listened, a new look settled on his face. It wasn't just grief. It was fury. Fury at illness, at helplessness, at the randomness of watching your child, once so vibrant, lie still under fluorescent lights. Moments later, William stepped outside and met Charlotte in the hallway. She was crying softly. He knelt beside her. "He's strong," he whispered. "He's going to fight." But the pain in his eyes told her he wasn't sure. In that moment, it didn't matter if he was a prince or a king in waiting. He was just a father on the edge of heartbreak. Catherine's breakdown. A mother unmasked. When Catherine entered the ICU, the nurses respectfully stepped back. She approached slowly, as if trying to anchor herself with every step. Her eyes locked on Louis, and the walls she had spent years building as a royal figure began to crumble. The Catherine the public knew, poised, regal, composed, was gone. Here stood a mother, heartbroken and terrified. She gently brushed her son's forehead, careful not to disturb the wires. Her lips trembled. "Mummy's here," she whispered. And then, for the first time in years, she wept openly. She sat beside him for hours, refusing to eat or rest. She held his tiny hand and whispered memories. She asked the doctors again and again for updates, for hope, for signs. At one point, the nanny came in. Catherine looked at her and shook her head. "He's just a baby. He's just our baby." Charlotte entered, clutching Louis's favorite blanket. She handed it to her mother and sat quietly on the floor. The blanket was placed on his chest. Catherine leaned in and kissed his forehead. "You'll come back to us," she whispered. And in that moment, the weight of monarchy, titles, expectations, all disappeared. What remained was just a family, holding on to love in the face of unimaginable fear. A medical crisis inside Louis's health battle. By the time the full team of physicians stabilized Prince Louis, the diagnosis had grown more serious. After hours of tests, specialists confirmed he was suffering from a rare aggressive inflammatory condition, likely autoimmune, possibly triggered by a viral infection his body couldn't fight. He was now under constant supervision in the intensive care unit at Royal Brompton Hospital, surrounded by the most advanced pediatric care Britain could provide. But for the Wales family, that wasn't comfort. It was a nightmare. Doctors explained everything in soft, technical terms: systemic inflammation, organ stress, neuroimmune complications. But for William and Catherine, one phrase stood out. "We are doing everything we can, but the next 24 hours are critical." The room was filled with quiet beeping, IV drips, heart monitors. Every sound mattered. Every silence terrified them. William stood behind the glass, arms crossed tightly, eyes locked on his son's still body. Catherine refused to leave the bedside. She held Louis's hand even as he slept, whispering softly about toy dinosaurs, bedtime stories, and the holidays they'd planned. Charlotte sat just outside the ICU. She clutched Louis's favorite stuffed fox, its ear worn from years of love. She wouldn't speak. When a nurse offered her a snack, she shook her head and turned her face to the wall. The atmosphere inside the hospital became reverent. Nurses moved quietly. Doctors exchanged notes in whispers. No one dared speak of worst-case scenarios. But the worry was there, behind every glance. At one point, Catherine and William stepped into the hallway alone. They didn't speak, but when their eyes met, it was as if they were both asking the same unspoken question. How did this happen so fast? They didn't have an answer. The nanny's guilt. Blame, love, and loyalty. Back at Adelaide Cottage, the royal nanny sat in silence. The house was still. The toys Louis had played with only a day earlier remained on the floor. His tiny trainers sat by the back door. His laughter, once the soundtrack of the home, had vanished. The nanny was heartbroken. She couldn't shake the feeling she had failed him. She met privately with palace aides and support staff, her voice cracking as she recounted the last week. He was quiet, more tired than usual. I didn't push hard enough. I thought I was protecting him, but I should have acted sooner. She broke down in tears, the weight of responsibility crushing her. It wasn't duty, it was love. She had helped raise Louis since he was a baby. She had held him through teething, fevers, night terrors. This wasn't just a job, it was family. When Prince William arrived later that evening to collect something from the nursery, he found her sitting in Louis's chair, her eyes red, her hands folded tightly. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You didn't fail him," he said softly. "You loved him. That's all we can ever do." Later, Charlotte, holding the stuffed fox, approached the nanny. She wiped her own tears and whispered, "He knows you're sad, but he doesn't blame you." In that moment, the royal hierarchy dissolved. There were no titles, no positions, just people joined in pain and love. The nanny promised herself she would never leave Louis's side again, not until he smiled again. When Charlotte lost control, the breaking point. Princess Charlotte had tried to stay strong. For her mother, for her brother, she had stayed quiet when the ambulance took Louis away. She had held back tears as the nurses moved through the halls. But children know more than they're told. And Charlotte felt the fear growing around her like a storm. It was late at night when she broke. She had been waiting outside the ICU again, hugging Louis's fox. A nurse passed, whispering something to a colleague. Charlotte didn't hear it all, just the words, "Still not responding." That was enough. She stood suddenly and approached a nurse. "Will he be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. The nurse crouched beside her, unsure how much to say, but Charlotte didn't wait for the answer. Her face crumpled, her body shook, and a sound, raw, heartbreaking, escaped from her. A full, unfiltered sob. For a moment, the entire ward seemed to pause. A royal child in tears, grieving in public, overwhelmed by fear. William arrived moments later and scooped her into his arms. He didn't ask what happened. He just held her tightly, whispering, "He's strong, darling. Just like you. You're strong too." But inside, William knew his daughter had just faced her first real encounter with helplessness. It would mark her forever. Later, Charlotte sat in a chair beside her mother, now curled on the hospital couch. Catherine stroked her daughter's hair, humming quietly. Louis's name was never spoken in that moment, but it didn't need to be. That night, the strength of a future queen met the heartbreak of a little sister. And the world watching felt every tear. Prince Louis fights back, a turning point. Just after 3 a.m., the hospital's ICU unit glowed under dimmed lights. Doctors had monitored Prince Louis for nearly 48 hours straight, watching every number on the machines, every flicker in his vitals. There had been no major change, until now. A subtle movement first. One of Louis's fingers twitched. Then, a slight flinch in his right hand. The nurse on duty noticed it instantly. She leaned in and whispered softly, "Louis?" His eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. The nurse didn't scream. She didn't panic, but her eyes filled with tears as she hit the call button. Within 90 seconds, a full medical team was by his side. His vitals were improving. His oxygen intake rose. The fever had dropped slightly. The swelling had begun to reverse. It wasn't a miracle, but it was the first real sign of hope. Charlotte, still curled in a waiting room chair, was the first family member told. When the nurse gently said, "He's waking up," she didn't say a word. She just looked up, eyes wide, and ran to find her parents. William and Catherine rushed into the ICU, still in their hospital sweats. They stood on either side of the bed, watching as Louis's eyes focused on them for the first time in days. His voice was hoarse, his body weak, but he smiled. "Hi, Mummy," he whispered. Catherine collapsed into sobs, holding his tiny hand to her cheek. "I never left," she whispered. "I never left you." For the first time since the emergency began, the Wales family felt oxygen return to the room. The pressure didn't vanish, but the suffocating panic did. William, who had remained composed for everyone else's sake, finally let his guard down. He placed his forehead against his son's and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. Soon after, Charlotte entered the room, holding the stuffed fox she'd carried since Louis fell ill. She placed it beside him and smiled through teary eyes. "I told him you'd come back," she said to her parents. "He promised me." The next 24 hours were crucial, but the mood shifted entirely. Doctors adjusted treatment. Louis was stable, responsive, and even asked for jelly and cartoons, a royal return to normalcy. Outside the hospital, word spread like wildfire. Crowds that had gathered for updates broke into spontaneous applause when the first good news emerged. Newspapers ran the headline, "Louis Tau the Brave, Royal Boy Pulls Through." Across Britain and across the world, people who had followed the story held their breath and exhaled together. In homes, offices, even schools, parents hugged their children a little tighter. The crisis hadn't ended, but Louis had fought back, and his quiet courage, at just 6 years old, became a symbol of resilience that touched hearts far beyond palace walls. Lessons learned, love, strength, and the future of the royal children. With Prince Louis on the mend, a different tone settled across the Wales household, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and quiet reflection. The whirlwind of sirens, diagnoses, tears, and bedside vigils had passed, but the emotional weight lingered. Catherine, standing at the hospital window, looked out at the sunrise. She hadn't slept properly in days, but her heart was full. "We were so close to losing him," she later told a close friend. "It changes everything." In many ways, it did. Not just for Louis, but for the entire royal family. Princess Charlotte, once the curious, playful middle child, had grown up overnight. The image of her weeping in the hallway, asking if Louis would survive, would stay with viewers forever. But so would her quiet strength, the way she comforted the nanny, the way she never let go of Louis's toy, the way she stood by him once he woke up. It was a reminder that royalty doesn't protect you from fear, from helplessness, from grief, but it can reveal character in its rawest, most human form. Prince William issued a brief public statement, thanking the medical staff and the public for their prayers. This was not just a family crisis. It reminded us how deeply connected we are to the people who stand with us. Through love, through hope, through heartbreak. The monarchy, often seen as a distant institution, suddenly felt close, accessible, human. In schools, children drew pictures of Prince Louis in a hospital bed, surrounded by hearts. In homes, parents shared their own stories of illness and recovery. Online, messages of hope poured in from every continent. A royal crisis had become a national reflection on family, health, and gratitude. As Louis began physiotherapy and recovery at home, the palace released a photo that would go viral. Charlotte holding Louis's hand as they sat under a tree in Windsor. No crown, no ceremony, just siblings in the sunlight, bonded forever. The image became symbolic, a visual promise that no matter how public their lives, their bond was real. The video closes on this final message. We saw a princess cry, we saw a mother break, we saw a young prince fall and rise again. But above all, we saw that love, pure, steady, and human, is what will guide the future of this royal family. What unfolded behind palace doors wasn't just a royal medical scare. It was a deeply human story. Princess Charlotte's tears showed the world that even within royalty, love and fear walk hand in hand. Prince Louis's brave recovery reminded us that resilience lives in the smallest hearts. Catherine and William didn't lead with protocol. They led with love. In a world that often sees royals as symbols, this crisis reminded us they are people first. Families hurt, children cry, parents break. But through it all, what remains is the unshakable bond between them. Charlotte's unwavering presence beside Louis, even in fear, gave us all a glimpse of strength beyond titles. As the royal family moves forward, they carry this moment, a private tragedy turned public lesson, forever etched in their story. And in the hearts of millions, Louis's recovery became a symbol of hope, healing, and the power of unconditional love.